Sarah Martinez wiped the sweat from her forehead as she lifted another heavy box from the moving truck. Her small frame seemed almost too delicate for the task, but she had learned long ago that appearances could be deceiving. The August sun beat down mercilessly on the quiet suburban street in Millfield, a small town she had chosen specifically for its promise of anonymity and peace. The moving men had left an hour ago, and Sarah preferred to handle the remaining boxes herself. She had always been particular about her belongings, especially the ones that held memories she wasn't ready to share with anyone. As she carried the last box into her modest two-bedroom house, she caught the curious stares of her new neighbors through their windows. She offered a polite wave to an elderly woman across the street, who quickly retreated behind her curtains. Sarah had bought this house with cash, a decision that had raised eyebrows at the real estate office. At 38, she looked younger than her years, with shoulder-length dark hair that she kept simple and practical. Her clothes were always neat but unremarkable: jeans, simple blouses, comfortable shoes. Nothing that would draw attention or suggest the extraordinary life she had lived for the past 2 decades. The house was perfect for her needs. It sat at the end of Maple Street, with a small yard that backed up to a wooded area. The neighbors seemed like the type who kept to themselves, which was exactly what Sarah wanted. She had chosen Millfield after researching dozens of small towns, looking for somewhere she could blend in and start over. Inside the house, Sarah methodically unpacked her belongings. Most of her furniture was new, purchased online and delivered before her arrival. She had left almost everything behind when she made the decision to retire and disappear from her old life. The few personal items she had brought were carefully wrapped and packed in 3 specific boxes that she had marked with small, discreet symbols only she would recognize. The first box contained photographs, not many, but each one precious. There were pictures of her family from before everything changed, images of places she had traveled to that tourists would never see, and a few rare moments of joy captured during the darkest periods of her career. She placed these carefully in a drawer in her bedroom, wrapped in soft cloth. The second box held her books. Not the technical manuals or strategy guides that had filled her shelves for years, but novels, poetry, and philosophy books she had collected over time. These represented the part of herself she had to keep hidden during her years of service, the part that craved beauty and meaning beyond mission objectives and tactical superiority. The third box was the heaviest, and she hesitated before opening it. Inside were her medals and commendations, her dress uniform, and a few personal items given to her by fellow service members who hadn't made it home. She touched the purple heart gently, remembering the day she had earned it and the weeks of recovery that followed. These items represented 20 years of her life that she could never fully explain to civilians, 20 years of sacrifice that had shaped her into someone she wasn't sure she knew how to be anymore. Sarah had joined the Navy at 18, young and eager to serve her country. Her family had been proud but worried, especially her grandmother who had raised her after her parents died in a car accident when she was 12. Her grandmother had been the only one who truly understood her drive to prove herself, to show the world that she was stronger than she looked. The path to becoming a Navy SEAL had been brutal. She was one of only a handful of women who had even been allowed to attempt the training, and the only one in her class to complete it. The physical challenges had been difficult enough, but the psychological warfare from some of her male counterparts had been even harder to endure. They had called her every name in the book, questioned her right to be there, and made it clear that they believed she would wash out before the first week was over. But Sarah had something that her tormentors didn't expect, an unbreakable will forged by years of loss and disappointment. Every insult, every attempt to break her down, only made her more determined. When others stumbled, she kept going. When others complained, she stayed silent and pushed harder. By the end of training, she had earned the grudging respect of even her harshest critics. Her first deployment had been to Afghanistan, where she quickly proved that her gender was irrelevant when it came to completing missions successfully. She could shoot with the best of them, think strategically under pressure, and maintain her composure in situations that would break most people. More importantly, she had an ability to connect with local populations, especially women and children, that made her invaluable for intelligence gathering and hearts and minds operations. Over the years, Sarah had served in places most Americans couldn't pronounce, participating in operations that would never be publicly acknowledged. She had saved lives, eliminated threats to national security, and carried out missions that required not just physical courage but moral strength. The weight of some of the decisions she had been forced to make still kept her awake at night. The toll of 2 decades of service had been immense. Sarah had seen friends die, had killed when necessary, and had missed every major milestone in the lives of the people she loved back home. Her grandmother had passed away while Sarah was on a mission she couldn't leave, and she had received the news via encrypted communication while sitting in a desert halfway around the world. Relationships had been nearly impossible. The few men who had shown interest in her couldn't handle the reality of her career, the deployments, the secrecy, and the way she sometimes woke up in the middle of the night reaching for weapons that weren't there. She had learned to keep her emotional walls high, to compartmentalize her feelings as efficiently as she organized her gear. The decision to retire hadn't been easy. Sarah was at the top of her game, respected by her peers and valued by her commanders. But she had begun to feel like she was losing herself in the role, becoming more machine than human. The final straw had come during her last mission, when she realized that she felt more comfortable in a war zone than she did in her apartment back home. Sarah knew that transitioning to civilian life would be challenging, but she had underestimated how difficult it would be to figure out who she was without her uniform, without her team, without the clear sense of purpose that had driven her for so long. In Millfield, she would have to learn how to be just Sarah, not Chief Petty Officer Martinez, not the woman who could rappel from helicopters and take out enemy combatants with precision accuracy. As she finished unpacking, Sarah stood in her living room and looked around at her new home. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse but functional. It looked like the home of someone who was still figuring out how to live, which was exactly what she was. Tomorrow, she would start the process of building a new life, finding a job, meeting her neighbors, maybe even making friends who didn't know how many ways she could kill someone with her bare hands. For now, though, she allowed herself to feel something she hadn't experienced in years: hope. Hope that she could find peace in this quiet town, hope that she could learn to sleep through the night without checking the locks 3 times, hope that someday she might be able to share her story with someone who would understand the price of freedom. Sarah made herself a simple dinner and sat on her back porch as the sun set through the trees. The sounds of suburban evening, children playing in distant yards, dogs barking, the hum of air conditioners, felt foreign but somehow comforting. This was the America she had spent 20 years defending, the peaceful everyday existence that most people took for granted. She thought about her grandmother, who had always believed that Sarah was destined for something special. Her grandmother had been a strong woman too, having worked in a factory during World War II while her husband was overseas. She would have been proud of what Sarah had accomplished, but she also would have understood the cost. As darkness fell, Sarah went inside and locked her doors, a habit that would probably never leave her. She checked her windows, set her alarm system, and placed a glass of water on her nightstand. These were the rituals of someone who had learned that danger could come at any time, from any direction. Before bed, Sarah opened the drawer where she had placed her photographs and pulled out a picture of herself in dress uniform at her retirement ceremony. She looked proud but tired, accomplished but somehow lost. The woman in the photo had achieved everything she had set out to do, but she looked like someone who wasn't sure what came next. Sarah placed the photo on her nightstand and turned off the lights. Tomorrow would be the beginning of her new life, and, for the first time in 20 years, she had no idea what it would hold. The uncertainty was both terrifying and exhilarating. She closed her eyes and listened to the sounds of her new neighborhood, so different from the sounds that had lulled her to sleep for the past 2 decades. In the darkness, Sarah made a promise to herself. She would give this new life everything she had, the same commitment and determination that had carried her through SEAL training and countless missions. She would learn to be a civilian, to be a neighbor, to be just Sarah. And, maybe, if she was very lucky, she would find a way to use all the strength and skills she had developed in service of something new, a life of her own choosing, built on her own terms. The transition wouldn't be easy. Sarah knew that the discipline, the hypervigilance, and the emotional barriers that had kept her alive for 20 years wouldn't disappear overnight. But she was ready to try, ready to discover who Sarah Martinez could be when she wasn't carrying the weight of national security on her shoulders. As sleep finally came, Sarah's last conscious thought was of her grandmother's voice, reminding her that she was stronger than she knew and braver than she felt. Tomorrow, in this quiet town where no one knew her story, she would begin the most challenging mission of her life, learning how to live at peace with herself and the choices she had made in service of her country. 3 weeks after moving to Millfield, Sarah found herself standing outside Miller's diner at 6 in the morning, adjusting the simple black uniform she had been given the day before. The diner was a classic small-town establishment, complete with red vinyl booths, a long counter with spinning stools, and the smell of bacon grease that seemed to have soaked into the very walls over decades of operation. Sarah had applied for the waitressing position on impulse, walking in after seeing the Help Wanted sign in the window during one of her exploratory walks around town. The owner, Frank Miller, was a gruff man in his 60s who had inherited the diner from his father. He had looked at Sarah with obvious skepticism when she told him she was new in town and looking for work. "You ever wait tables before?" Frank had asked, wiping his hands on a stained apron. "No, sir, but I learn quickly and I'm reliable," Sarah had answered honestly. Frank had studied her for a long moment, taking in her military posture and the way she made direct eye contact without flinching. "You military?" The question had caught Sarah off guard. She had been so focused on trying to blend in that she hadn't realized her bearing was still so obvious. "Former Navy," she had admitted. "My brother was Navy," Frank had said, his expression softening slightly. "Died in Vietnam. You can start Monday." Now, as Sarah pushed through the diner's front door, she felt a familiar nervous energy that reminded her of the first day of any new assignment. The difference was that this time, she wasn't carrying weapons or classified intel, just an order pad and a determination to prove she could handle civilian life. The morning shift at Miller's diner began at 6 and ran until 2. Sarah quickly learned that breakfast was the busiest time, with a steady stream of regulars who came in for coffee and conversation before heading to work. There was Joe Patterson, a retired postal worker who always ordered 2 eggs over easy with wheat toast, Margaret Henderson, who ran the town's flower shop and preferred her coffee black with a side of gossip, and Dr. Williams, the town's only veterinarian, who grabbed a quick breakfast sandwich between emergency calls. Frank's wife, Dorothy, worked the morning shift with Sarah, handling the register and helping to train her. Dorothy was Frank's opposite, warm, chatty, and seemingly delighted to have someone new to talk to. She had been married to Frank for 42 years and knew every person who walked through the diner's doors. The secret to waitressing, Dorothy explained as she showed Sarah how to balance multiple plates on one arm, is remembering that everyone who comes in here is somebody's family. Treat them like you'd want your own grandmother treated. Sarah found herself oddly comforted by the routine of the diner. There was something familiar about the early hours, the precision required to manage multiple orders simultaneously, and the importance of teamwork. In many ways, it reminded her of military life, just without the life or death stakes. The work was physically demanding in a different way than she was used to. Instead of carrying heavy packs across difficult terrain, she was on her feet for 8 hours straight, weaving between tables, balancing trays, and memorizing orders. Her military fitness served her well, but by the end of her first week, her feet ached in a way that was entirely new. Most of the customers were polite, if a bit curious about the new face. Millfield was small enough that everyone eventually heard about everyone else's business, and word had gotten around that Frank had hired someone new. Sarah deflected personal questions as politely as possible, sticking to basic facts. She was new in town, had bought the house on Maple Street, and was looking forward to being part of the community. But not everyone at Miller's diner was welcoming. There was a group of men who came in every Tuesday and Thursday morning, construction workers from a company that had contracts throughout the county. They were loud, crude, and seemed to take particular pleasure in making the staff uncomfortable. Dorothy had warned Sarah about them on her third day. "Just ignore anything they say that's inappropriate," Dorothy had advised, her usually cheerful demeanor turning serious. "Frank's banned them before, but they always come back eventually, and their money spends the same as everyone else's." The group was led by a man named Rick Brennan, a foreman in his mid-40s who seemed to believe that his position gave him the right to treat service workers however he pleased. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with arms covered in tattoos and a perpetual sneer that made Sarah's skin crawl. His crew, 4 other men ranging in age from their 20s to their 50s, followed his lead in everything, laughing at his jokes and echoing his comments. Sarah's first encounter with Rick's crew came on her second Tuesday at the diner. She had been working for a week and was beginning to feel confident in her abilities when the 5 men walked in, their boots muddy from whatever job site they had come from. They took their usual table in the back corner, and Dorothy shot Sarah a sympathetic look. "I'll take that table," Dorothy offered, but Sarah shook her head. "I can handle it," Sarah said, picking up her order pad and walking over to the corner booth. Well, what have we here?" Rick said loudly as Sarah approached. Frank finally found himself some decent eye candy. Sarah kept her expression neutral and professional. "Good morning, gentlemen. What can I get started for you today? How about you start by telling us your name, sweetheart?" Rick said, leaning back in his seat with his arms crossed. "I like to know the names of pretty girls who are serving me." "My name is Sarah, and I'm happy to take your order when you're ready," she replied evenly. "Sarah," Rick repeated, drawing out her name. "That's a pretty name for a pretty girl. You new in town, Sarah?" Sarah had dealt with men like Rick before, though in different circumstances. In the military, there had been protocols for handling harassment, clear chains of command, and consequences for inappropriate behavior. Here, she was just trying to do her job and earn a living. "I'll give you a few more minutes to look at the menu," Sarah said, starting to turn away. "Hold on there, sweetheart," Rick called after her. "I wasn't done talking to you. Where are you from? You don't look like you're from around here." Sarah turned back, maintaining her professional smile despite the way Rick's eyes were traveling over her body. "I'm originally from California. Are you ready to order, or would you like a few more minutes?" "California, huh?" Rick said with a laugh. "That explains a lot. Bet you're one of those liberal types who thinks she's better than everyone else." Sarah felt a familiar tension building in her shoulders, the same feeling she used to get before combat situations. She forced herself to relax, to remember that she was in a diner in Ohio, not a war zone in Afghanistan. "I'll be back in a few minutes to take your order," she said firmly, and walked away before Rick could respond. At the counter, Dorothy gave her an encouraging smile. "You handled that well. They're always testing new people." "Is it always like that?" Sarah asked, refilling her coffee pot. "Usually worse," Dorothy admitted. "But don't let them get to you. Most of the people in this town are good folks. Rick and his crew are just, well, they're bullies. Always have been." Sarah nodded, but she was already mentally cataloging everything she had observed about the group. Rick was clearly the alpha, used to being in control and having his authority unchallenged. The others deferred to him completely, which suggested they either feared him or had been conditioned to follow his lead. Their body language was aggressive but also performative. They were putting on a show as much for each other as for anyone watching. When Sarah returned to take their order, Rick had clearly decided to escalate his behavior. "So, California girl," he said with a grin that didn't reach his eyes, "what brings you to our little town? Boyfriend troubles? Husband finally get tired of you? What can I get you to eat this morning?" Sarah asked, pen poised over her order pad. "I'll have the breakfast special," Rick said, "but first I want to know what your story is." Single girl moves to a small town where she doesn't know anybody, that's either running from something or running to something. Sarah felt her jaw tighten, but she kept her voice level. "Breakfast special comes with 2 eggs. How would you like those prepared?" Rick leaned forward, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was a seductive tone. "You know what I'd like prepared, sweetheart?" The other men at the table burst into laughter, and Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Not from embarrassment, but from anger, a cold, controlled anger that she had learned to harness during her years of service. "Scrambled or over easy?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough edge to make Rick pause. He stared at her for a moment, clearly not used to having his intimidation tactics met with calm professionalism. "Over easy," he said finally. Sarah took the rest of their orders efficiently and walked back to the kitchen, where Frank was working the grill. He looked up as she clipped the order tickets to the rail. "Everything okay out there?" he asked, and Sarah realized he had been listening to the exchange. "Everything's fine," Sarah replied, but Frank's expression suggested he wasn't convinced. The rest of Rick's table's visit proceeded without major incident, though the men continued to make inappropriate comments and suggestions throughout their meal. Sarah served them with the same professional courtesy she showed every customer, refusing to be drawn into their attempts to provoke a reaction. As they were leaving, Rick made a point of stopping by the register where Sarah was ringing up another customer. "See you Thursday, Sarah," he said, making her name sound like a threat. "Looking forward to getting to know you better." After they left, the diner seemed to collectively exhale. Sarah noticed that several other customers had been watching the interaction, some with disapproval and others with what looked like sympathy. "Don't let Rick get to you," said Dr. Williams, who had been sitting at the counter during the entire exchange. "He's been like that since high school. All talk, no substance." "Some people never grow up," added Margaret Henderson, shaking her head. "His poor wife puts up with so much." Sarah was surprised to learn that Rick was married, though she supposed it shouldn't have been shocking. Men like him often had families at home while they acted like single predators in public. As the lunch rush began, Sarah found herself thinking about Rick and his crew. In her previous life, she would have had options for dealing with men like that: official channels, superior officers, and, ultimately, the authority that came with her rank and training. Here, she was just another working woman trying to make a living, with no real recourse against customers who made her uncomfortable. The thought was both frustrating and liberating. Frustrating because she felt powerless in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Liberating because for the first time in 2 decades, the stakes of her daily conflicts were purely personal rather than matters of national security. During her break, Sarah stepped outside behind the diner and called the number her therapist at the VA had given her for situations like this. Dr. Patricia Hayes had been helping veterans transition to civilian life for over 15 years, and she had warned Sarah that she would face challenges she couldn't anticipate. "It's normal to feel frustrated," Dr. Hayes said after Sarah described the morning's events. "You're used to having clear authority and defined protocols for dealing with difficult people. In civilian life, especially in service jobs, the power dynamics are very different. I know how to handle men like Rick," Sarah said. "But not like this. Not when I'm supposed to smile and take their money." Learning to navigate civilian workplace dynamics is one of the hardest parts of transition, Dr. Hayes acknowledged. The skills that kept you alive and successful in the military don't always translate directly to civilian situations. But your core strength, your ability to remain calm under pressure, those are assets anywhere. After the call, Sarah felt somewhat better. She had known that civilian life would require different strategies, but she hadn't fully appreciated how disorienting it would be to feel vulnerable in what should have been a routine work situation. The afternoon shift was calmer, with mostly older customers who treated Sarah with kindness and respect. She began to understand what Dorothy meant about treating customers like family. These people were genuinely part of a community, people who had known each other for decades and who looked out for one another. As her shift ended, Frank pulled Sarah aside. "You did good today," he said gruffly. "Rick's been coming in here for years, and I've seen him make 3 other waitresses quit. You handled yourself well." "Thank you," Sarah said. "I appreciate the job." Frank studied her for a moment. "You remind me of my brother," he said finally. He had that same way of staying calm when everyone else was losing their heads. Made him a good sailor. As Sarah drove home, she reflected on her first real challenge as a civilian. Rick and his crew represented something she would have to learn to navigate: people who would test her boundaries, try to make her feel small, and attempt to assert power over her simply because they could. The difference now was that she had to find ways to protect herself and maintain her dignity without relying on the authority and training that had defined her for 20 years. She had to learn to be strong as Sarah the waitress, not Chief Petty Officer Martinez. It was a humbling realization, but also an important one. Sarah understood that learning to handle men like Rick was part of learning to live in the world as a civilian woman. She couldn't intimidate them with her rank or her skills. She had to find other ways to command respect and protect herself. That evening, as Sarah prepared dinner in her quiet kitchen, she thought about the other customers who had witnessed Rick's behavior. Some had looked uncomfortable, others had offered her support afterward. This suggested that not everyone in Millfield approved of Rick's actions, which meant she wasn't as alone as she had felt during those uncomfortable moments. Sarah made a mental note to pay attention to the community dynamics she was observing. Understanding the social structure of her new home would be just as important as learning to balance plates and memorize orders. She needed to figure out who the real leaders were, who could be trusted, and who might become allies if she ever needed them. For now, though, she was content to take things one day at a time. She had survived her first real test as a civilian, and, while it hadn't been pleasant, she had proven to herself that she could handle it. Rick would be back on Thursday, and she would be ready for him. As she settled into her evening routine, Sarah felt a quiet satisfaction. She was building something here, a new life, a new identity, and new relationships. It wouldn't be easy, and there would be more challenges ahead, but she was beginning to believe that she could make it work. The woman who had spent 20 years protecting her country was learning to protect herself in an entirely different way, and, for the first time since retiring, Sarah felt like she might actually succeed at this civilian life after all. 6 weeks into her job at Miller's Diner, Sarah had settled into a comfortable routine. Her initial nervousness had given way to confidence, and she had begun to build genuine relationships with the regular customers. Margaret Henderson brought her flowers from the shop every Friday, Dr. Williams always asked about her week, and even Gruff Frank had started leaving her small compliments about her work ethic. But Rick Brennan and his crew remained a dark cloud that appeared every Tuesday and Thursday morning, like a storm system that Sarah could predict but couldn't avoid. The harassment had escalated gradually over the weeks. What had started as inappropriate comments had evolved into more aggressive behavior. Rick had taken to accidentally brushing against Sarah when she passed his table, making increasingly personal remarks about her appearance and living situation, and asking invasive questions about her past that she continued to deflect with professional courtesy. Sarah had developed strategies for dealing with them. She made sure to serve their table when other customers were present, kept her interactions brief and task-focused, and had memorized the layout of the diner well enough to avoid being cornered in isolated areas. These were tactics she might have used in hostile territory, adapted for a small-town restaurant. The breaking point came on a rainy Thursday morning in October. Sarah had arrived at work to find that Dorothy had called in sick with the flu, leaving her to handle the morning rush alone with just Frank in the kitchen. The diner was busier than usual due to the weather, with people seeking warm coffee and shelter from the storm. Sarah was managing well, despite being short-staffed, when Rick and his crew walked in. They were louder than usual, clearly having started their day with something stronger than coffee. Rick's eyes found Sarah immediately, and his grin was predatory in a way that made her instinctively catalog potential exits and weapons. Well, if it isn't our favorite California girl," Rick announced as they took their usual table. "Looks like you're all by yourself today, Sarah." Sarah continued taking another customer's order, but she could feel Rick's eyes on her. When she finally approached their table, the dynamic felt different, more dangerous. "What can I get for you gentlemen today?" she asked, notepad ready. "How about some personal attention?" Rick said with a laugh that his crew dutifully echoed. "You've been keeping us at arm's length for weeks now, sweetheart. Time to get friendly." "I'll need your food order," Sarah said firmly. Rick leaned back in his seat, studying her with an expression that made Sarah's skin crawl. "You know what I think, boys," he said to his crew without taking his eyes off Sarah. "I think our little waitress here thinks she's too good for us." "That's not true," Sarah replied evenly. "I treat all customers with equal respect." "Equal respect," Rick repeated mockingly. "That's corporate talk. That's what someone says when they think they're better than the people they're serving." Sarah felt the familiar tension building in her shoulders, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Are you ready to order, or do you need a few more minutes with the menu?" "I'm ready for a lot of things," Rick said, his voice dropping to a tone that made Sarah's training kick in. Every instinct she had developed over 20 years of military service was telling her that this situation was about to escalate beyond words. "The breakfast special comes with," Sarah began, but Rick cut her off. "You know what your problem is?" Rick said, standing up suddenly. The movement was aggressive enough that Sarah automatically took a half step back, her body positioning itself for potential conflict. "Your problem is that you think you're special. You think you can come into our town and look down on us working people." "I don't think I'm special," Sarah said quietly. "I'm just trying to do my job." "Your job," Rick said with a snort. "Lady, your job is to serve people like us. Your job is to be nice to customers who are keeping this place in business. Your job is to smile and say thank you when paying customers give you compliments." The other customers in the diner had begun to notice the commotion. Sarah could see Margaret Henderson and Dr. Williams at the counter, both looking concerned. Frank had appeared in the kitchen doorway, wiping his hands on his apron. "I'm always polite to customers," Sarah said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to course through her veins. "Polite," Rick repeated. "That's not what I'm talking about, and you know it. I'm talking about being friendly. I'm talking about showing some appreciation when someone takes an interest in you." Rick took a step closer to Sarah, and she could smell alcohol on his breath mixed with cigarettes and something else that reminded her of fear, the smell of a man who was used to intimidating others but wasn't quite as confident as he pretended to be. "I need you to step back," Sarah said quietly, but her words carried an authority that surprised everyone in the diner, including herself. Rick paused, something in her tone registering even through his alcohol-fueled bravado. But his crew was watching, and backing down wasn't something his ego could tolerate. "You need me to step back," he said with a laugh. "Lady, this is a public place. I'll stand wherever I want to stand." Rick moved even closer, now within arm's reach of Sarah. In her previous life, this would have been the moment when she would have issued a clear warning, followed by immediate action if the warning was ignored. Here, she was trapped by social conventions and the need to keep her job. "Rick, maybe we should just order our food," one of his crew members said nervously. The man had noticed that the entire diner had gone quiet, with everyone watching the confrontation. "Shut up, Danny," Rick snapped. "I'm having a conversation with the waitress here." Rick reached out and touched Sarah's arm, his fingers wrapping around her wrist in a grip that was clearly meant to intimidate. "You know what I think," he said, his face inches from hers. "I think you need someone to teach you some manners. Teach you how to treat people in a small town." The touch was what broke Sarah's carefully maintained self-control. For 6 weeks, she had endured verbal harassment, inappropriate comments, and increasingly aggressive behavior. She had been professional, polite, and patient far beyond what should have been required of anyone. But physical contact crossed a line that 20 years of military training wouldn't allow her to ignore. Sarah's reaction was swift and precise. She grabbed Rick's wrist with her free hand, applied pressure to a specific point, and twisted in a way that forced him to release her arm while causing enough pain to get his immediate attention. The movement was so quick and efficient that most people in the diner didn't even see it happen. They only saw Rick suddenly pull his hand back with a gasp of surprise and pain. "Don't touch me," Sarah said quietly, but her voice carried a tone that Rick had never heard from a waitress before. Rick stared at her in shock, flexing his fingers where she had grabbed him. The pain had been significant enough to get through his alcoholic haze, and he was beginning to realize that something about this situation wasn't quite what he had expected. "What the hell was that?" he demanded, more confused than angry. "That was me asking you politely to keep your hands to yourself," Sarah replied, her posture having shifted subtly into something that trained observers would recognize as a combat stance. Frank had moved from the kitchen doorway to behind the counter, and Sarah could see him reaching for something, probably the baseball bat he kept for emergencies. "I think you gentlemen should order your food or leave," Frank called out, his voice carrying the authority of a business owner who had decided he'd seen enough. But Rick was too angry and embarrassed to de-escalate now. Being physically handled by a woman half his size in front of his crew and a diner full of witnesses had wounded his pride in a way that his alcohol-clouded judgment couldn't tolerate. "You think you're tough," he said to Sarah, taking another step forward despite the warning he had just received. "You think you can put your hands on me?" "I think you should sit down and order your breakfast," Sarah said, but she was already calculating distances and angles, identifying potential weapons within reach, and noting the positions of innocent bystanders who might need protection if this situation deteriorated further. Nobody puts their hands on me, Rick snarled. Especially not some stuck-up waitress who thinks she's better than everyone else. Rick raised his hand as if to strike Sarah, and, later, witnesses would disagree about exactly what happened next. Some said Sarah moved so fast she seemed to blur. Others said it looked like Rick simply fell down for no apparent reason. Dr. Williams, who had the best view from his seat at the counter, would later tell his wife that he had never seen anything like it. What actually happened was that Sarah executed a textbook defensive maneuver, redirecting Rick's momentum and sending him to the ground with minimal force but maximum efficiency. Rick found himself on his back on the diner floor, staring up at the ceiling, with no clear understanding of how he had gotten there. The silence in the diner was absolute. Sarah stood over Rick, her posture relaxed but ready, looking